Well, it's positive that it's stable, but again, we unfortunately, all these buzzwords or acronyms are coming about these days. We're part of the so-called Fragile Five, which JP Morgan came up with toward the latter part of last year, which means we have a high current account deficit, we have almost a plunging currency, we can talk about the currency valuation, and this puts us in a very vulnerable position. So going forward, stable is good, but I'm afraid at the very least the first half of this year, particularly with US tapering of buying emerging market bonds, we're going to have a very rocky 6 months ahead, I'm afraid.
Our debt ceiling has been rising, and just tell us, it's I think at 48% of the GDP. How does that affect our outlook for the next couple of years, say up till 2015, 16 even?
Well, it's actually not as bad as many would think. I mean, compared to our debt to GDP, compared to many Western traditional first world economies, particularly West European, we're actually doing phenomenally well. However, a lot of this is sentiment driven as well. The problem is of South Africa right now, we're a relatively low growth economy, 2% at best. We should be getting, there's no reason why we should not be getting double that figure at the very least, and be more competitive perhaps of our other emerging market peers. I think also for this year we have a heightened sense, at least a sense of political risk. Yeah. The fiery political rhetoric leading up to elections will not help our cause. All the Fragile Five will all be having elections this year. So yeah, it's a tough year, to be honest, for emerging markets, and we're squarely in that camp.
Talk about the rest of the continent. Africa, Barack Obama visited it towards the end of last year and gave Africa the rubber stamp of approval. Says that the outlook for the next decade or so is quite good for the African continent. Just tell us a little bit about that, and who do you see as the sort of star nations that will be rising up in the next decade?
Well, there's a few standing out. There's the stars, as you mentioned. There's the laggards as well, and Africa's a mixed bag. We can't always say, well, this is Africa's sort of future, because it's a very heterogeneous, complex political economy. Next week, in fact, at the IDC, Front Advisory is hosting the Africa Outlook 2014 conference, and we'll be talking exactly about this. What's the outlook for Africa through an economic lens, a financial lens, and always importantly for security governance lens as well. So the country is standing out. And the story, which maybe we'll be talking about next month, is Nigeria. Nigeria in February will be rebasing its GDP, which has not been done since 1990. What this will result in is very likely that in terms of the headline GDP figures, Nigeria is soon to become the biggest economy in Africa. Bragging rights go to Nigeria rather than us. So it's big. Size maybe is less important, quantity is less important than quality, but nevertheless a focus will be in Nigeria. I think Kenya's the regional hegemon, of course. It continues to plod along despite its governance challenges, perhaps, and security issues. But key countries, Rwanda, I must say, Mauritius, of course, Mozambique and Tanzania, Ghana, those are ones, and Ethiopia. They're standing out for me.
The sort of links for South Africa, especially with East Africa, do we see a lot of infrastructure projects and that sort of stuff happening between these countries? And how will that affect our economic outlook and growth over the next couple of years?
We always talk about region integration. East Africa is the most progressive region around banging together, integrating the countries in the region, 140-odd million people in East Africa. Other regions are nowhere near as progressive, including our own in SADC, which is 15 member countries. Yeah. The DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, has certainly been trying to promote at the very least, a preferential trade arrangement between SADC, COMESA, moving up the sort of East Coast, Central East Coast, up to Egypt almost, and also the EAC, the East African Community. That's a very progressive move, of course, looking to liberalise and get greater market access for South African companies into the region. The story for 2014 for me is less about South Africa. We're all a bit pessimistic. Yeah. It's more about the opportunity for South African companies in the region through this market liberalisation. It's our own economic neighbourhood, and after all, we're one of the world's most high-growth regions currently.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about the passing of Nelson Mandela. That's what that has done for our outlook, and then also, if you can just quickly tell us the prospects for the Rand in the next year or two.
I think the easy one on the Rand, I think it's all pretty bearish, negative sentiment. Again, don't shoot the messenger. But it's I heard on the radio on SFM driving here this morning that we're nudging 11 to the dollar. This is very problematic. We effectively import inflation through the oil price. With a low currency, everything becomes expensive, and countries like Brazil, the best example is, inflation hits the poorest the hardest. For a country to develop, it has to control inflation. On Mandela's legacy, clearly I think we've started a new year 2014. the legacy of Mandela, more about the nation-building legacy of Mandela, will always be remembered. But I think the economics discussion is a very separate issue. I don't think investors are being sentimental about this, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, that's the harsh reality of the world we live in. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Dr. Martyn Davies, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Frontier Advisory. Thank you once again.
Thank you.